I think we're really honored today to have a speaker join us who's going to try to share a little bit about his perspective, his research, and his work on what makes education policy. What's actually happening behind the scenes? We are all impacted by education policy, regardless of whether we work in education, whether we have a friend, a loved one, a child in our education system, or we ourselves are part of an education system. We are impacted by that policy, but do we really understand what goes on behind the scenes? Why are certain decisions made the way they are? There are trade-offs, but what are the trade-offs that we are thinking about? What is the impact of some of these trade-offs? So we're really honored today to have joining us from Jesus College, Mr. Loic Menzies, who is going to share his perspectives with you during today's THF dialogue. So Loic, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for that nice introduction too. And so yes, I'm Loic, and I've come all the way from England, from Cambridge. This is actually part of a bigger trip. I've also been in Australia for the last month and New Zealand before that. So I'm actually going to have done a full circle of the globe by the end of this trip. So it's quite an adventure. But the reason I'm doing it is because this sector, the education sector, has actually fascinated me for most of my life. So I began my career firstly as a youth worker back when I was a teenager, working in Cambridge. I then became a teacher. And then I became really interested in the system level. I became really interested in the decisions that shaped the sector and why these were appearing and affecting me in my day-to-day life as a teacher without me really understanding them. But it also meant that I felt that by being involved in policy, I also had an opportunity to make changes at quite a big scale that would impact on kids around the country and internationally, rather than just in my classroom, even if it was a lighter form of impact. So in 2009, I left teaching and school leadership, and I set up an organization which came to be known as the Centre for Education and Youth. And I described it as a think and action tank, because I wanted to work not just on policy, but I also still wanted to have some impact on the ground too. So I tried to combine that with this think and action tank concept. And I led that organization for about 13 years and left there a year and a half ago because I wanted to make sense of everything I'd been seeing. Everything I'd been seeing in policy and all the decisions that I was seeing and being involved in. I wanted to actually take a step back and say, what's actually going on here and what can I share with people outside of this policy bubble about what goes on inside? And that's why I came up with the concept of this sort of black box of policy. And what I wanted to do was try and explain this strange black box that seems to spit out decisions on policy that affect people in classrooms, whether they be children, whether they be the parents, whether they be the teachers, and yet people don't really understand where they come from. And there are certain formal models and processes that try to explain these things. But I think that they fail to really match up to the reality of what happens day to day in policymaking a lot of the time. So what I've been doing is some quite extensive research. I've been having to bring together a lot of different fields of work. So looking at the literacy on public policy, but also on political theory, also on the history of education. And I've also tried to combine that with some really interesting primary research. So I've been interviewing very senior politicians like secretaries of state, ministers, their special advisors, all the people who work in the policy ecosystem in the UK. So mainly focusing in on England, but now through this trip that I've been doing, learning a little bit about how that compares to other places. And my hope for today is that I can introduce some of the key ideas that are coming out of that. And try also to facilitate a discussion where we'll be giving you some prompt questions for you to share your own experiences from the jurisdictions that you're working in, whether in the room here or those of you joining online from all sorts of different countries. And it will be quite a whistle-stop tour. It's going to be quite rapid because I think in a way, each of the themes I'm going to talk about really require their own lecture. But I'm going to try and take you through as much of it as possible. And you know, we've got some Q&A time at the end. So if there's anything I go through too fast, you can always ask me for a bit more about it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with a sort of quick framing as to what I mean by policy. And so what is policy? Because it's actually not as obvious as people sometimes think. We're then going to look at this question of history, continuity, and change. and explore the question of who the key actors are in making education policy, how that varies between countries, as well as some of the coalitions and trade-offs that happen between those different actors to make the policies end up coming out. There we'll pause for our first Q&A session, and then in the second half, we'll start off by thinking about evidence and expertise, including some of the challenges of so-called evidence-based policy. And finally, we'll turn to some of the most intangible influences and vehicles for the policy, the ideas, narratives, and ideologies that sit behind policy. And throughout that, there's two dynamics that I'm going to come back to time and again. One is what I call funneling, and by that I mean how each of these different factors narrow things down and narrow down the range of options that can be implemented. And then the opposite dynamic of chaos, whereby sometimes these unexpected and unplanned things can emerge from these chaotic interactions between different factors. So that's what we'll do there, and then we'll go on to another little Q&A before I try to bring it all together into some form of coherence. So let's go back first to this question of what is policy. So people quite often say to me, oh, education policy, that sounds really interesting, I want to do that. But really, any of you who maybe have been scholars of public policy to some extent will know that it's not that simple to put our finger on by what we mean by policy. And there are theories such as enactment and for focus on implementation, which show that actually policy isn't just a decision at the top. So it's not that simple. And I think a good story to share on this to try and explain that is the policy in the UK of what was called free schools. So a policy of free schools, some of you may have heard of it. It was a policy introduced by the 2010 Conservative-led government to provide for independent state-funded schools that could be maybe set up by parents and so on. And what we had there was a policy that was premised on an idea of giving parents more power, creating more innovation, competition and autonomy in the sector, built on the Swedish model of free schools and the US model of charter schools. So that, in a way, was the intent that sat behind that policy. But I also remember the morning that this policy was announced, because I was invited into the Department for Education along with another few teachers. And I remember listening to the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, making a speech about this policy. And what he told us was that parents were going to be able to set up schools even upstairs from chip shops. So disused rooms around the country would be turned into schools through the initiative of parents. And what we had there was a speech, which is a form of text. And so we had policy as a text. Then it came to the question of legislation. And it actually turned out that there was very little legislation needed because there was a precedent to build on, which is something I'm going to come back to. So there we have policy as two forms of text, the speech and the legislation. And then we came to the reality, the enacted fact. And what happened in the end was that 2/3 of these schools became parts of chains of schools, in which in fact they actually had probably a bit less autonomy than other schools. It also turned out that only 1/5 of them were set up by parents, and all new schools ended up being classified as free schools, regardless of what they were like. So that was the enacted reality. And that's typical of how once a policy is created, it becomes a sort of institution that clashes with reality and has to be adapted and enacted by the people involved in actually delivering it. And yet that's still, to a certain extent, part of the policy because it changes and evolves as time goes on. So what do I mean when I'm talking about policy, and what am I looking at in my research and in what I share with you today? So to some extent, I feel a little bit guilty about this because I'm actually focusing on that top and middle level, even though I understand that that enactment level is so important. But for the purposes of what I'm doing, I'm looking at the decisions. So what I want to look at is this top level of communicating a values-based intention for a system combined with a high-level strategic plan for getting there, as well as the mid-level, which is working out an approach to bringing about a system-level goal, taking into account current or likely constraints. So that's what I'm looking at in this work at the moment. So let's move on now to have a think about how these policies are actually made and start to pull apart this black box. So one of the most common complaints I hear about policy in schools is the idea of churn, the idea of constant change. So in England, we have a constant stream of different initiatives that come from politicians. They have a particular predilection for mentoring schemes and for school improvement hubs of various forms. And so there are constant new initiatives in some of these areas. And that can be quite frustrating to people because the new things keep appearing before the last one's even been properly implemented. There's also a concern about a sort of pendulum in policy, where things seem to swing from a focus, say, in curriculum on knowledge versus skills, or in reading on phonics versus whole word teaching, or breadth versus depth in curriculum, or when it comes to how we run a system, autonomy versus centralization. And the pendulum seems to swing from one side to the other, much to people's frustrations. But really, as my research has progressed, I've actually become less and less sure about where I sit on this question of continuity and churn. And I think this quote here, which is from a former special advisor to the Secretary of State, captures some of the concerns. So I'll read it out. The dynamics of politics have probably brought about a greater degree of continuity, but a continuity combined with radical reform. I think it's the latter part of that has come from the politicians who are in tune with the public mood. If you left it to the educationalists to agree amongst themselves and move things on from one day to the next, the reality is that you would not have had the degree of accountability in the system. You would not have had the level of improvement that has undoubtedly been in the school system under successive governments if it wasn't for the politicians who are taking up the cudgels and really driving this forward. Now, there's a lot you could question in that quote. And actually, a lot of people would even question the idea of this continuous improvement. However, there's a few things I think are quite interesting here. Firstly, this quote, this policymaker, raises questions about the desirability of continuity, and therefore makes us think about responsiveness versus stability, which is one of the things we're going to turn to in our Q&A. Because we have to acknowledge that there's a certain desirability to change. Policymakers have to respond to events. They have to respond to public and sector opinion. Research throws out new insights, which change the evidence base. And the society and the world is always changing. One of the things I admire here in Singapore when I talk to people is people are very aware of a changing world and the need for policy to adapt to that, and seeing that as part of a source of resilience. But on the other hand, stability also has its own benefits. Change creates workload for teachers and distracts them sometimes from the core business of teaching. Too much change also makes it very hard to refine and polish and develop things. So perhaps the real problem is what I call policy by whim, when new pronouncements are made and constant new initiatives are kicked out. Perhaps that's what people are really concerned about. Secondly, in this quote, there's a question over how much change there actually is. And I agree that I'm not actually sure that change always typifies what goes on in the systems I study. And theories of incrementalism in policy might actually be more accurate. Take the theme of devolving power of schools and autonomy. That things like a policy like free schools emerged from that. I said that was one of the intentions behind that. And that was one of those initiatives that people felt was disruptive. And yet, when you look at the detail of that policy, as I said, the legislation change that was needed was very minor. And the reason for that was because it built on precedent. So the previous Labour government had introduced academies, which were already a form of independent school funded by the state. And if you look back at those policies, which were controversial in their own time, they also built on decades of previous Conservative governments who had been liberating, so as they saw it, schools from the local authority and giving them more autonomy. So actually, despite the fact that something looked like a new initiative, it was actually an example of continuity and change in a particular direction. I also mentioned the pendulum on reading, teaching, and phonics. So a similar thing happened. The current government announced a phonics check for 7-year-olds, a new test that would happen, and teachers were frustrated by the fact that a new test was landing that they had to work towards. But actually, that phonics test built on the national literacy strategy, which was introduced by the previous Labour government, which in itself built on a pilot that was run by the previous Conservative government. So much so that despite being from opposite political parties and being enemies, The previous Conservative Secretary of State, 𝗔𝗯cie𝘂𝘁, had actually met with the Labour leader, David 𝗔𝗯cie, and his advisor, Michael Barber, in advance of the election to prepare the plans for rolling out that pilot. So again, something that seemed like change was actually an example of continuity. So ultimately, once you start looking at history, we can see that the nature of change is perhaps a bit more incremental. And that's not just in England. You can see the same in Australia. The academic 𝗙𝗘𝗔𝗗 has talked about how that you have these surface level waves of change in policy, but actually deep underneath, there are strong undercurrents that go in the same direction over time. So now we've questioned that. I now want to think about how history does exert this influence. So one part of that is the evolution of and dominance of different ideas, which is something we'll be talking about in the second half of the talk. But history also exerts an influence by creating switching costs. So it can be quite expensive to start from scratch, to take something apart and begin again. And we also have cognitive biases that make us, that bias us against abandoning failed policies. We prefer to layer one policy on another, or to adapt or to convert, as the academic hacker puts it. So we try and take the existing policy and evolve it rather than necessarily starting from scratch. So that weds us in some way to history. Policymakers, one of the big drivers for them is often the idea of legacy, particularly for politicians in the public eye. And that can mean that they actually take active steps to embed or entrench a policy. They might create new institutions that fix a policy in some way or other, or they might create legislation that's hard to change, or appoint people to key positions who they know will be guardians of that policy. That can happen to such an extent that when the current schools minister, Nick Gibb, came into power, he said he had to blow up the concrete of the establishment. So thus, if we return to this theme of funneling, we can see that the process of path dependency can mean that the range of options that policymakers consider is constrained and narrowed by precedent. So politicians rarely make a policy based on an optimal blank slate. So having acknowledged the role of history, and now I want to turn to some of these key actors that influence policy and the negotiated interactions, trade-offs and power plays between them, and how those shape the decisions that come out of that black box. This is another area people have strong views on, saying that education policy should be taken out of politicians' hands or out of technocrats' hands. But as we saw out in that quote from the special advisor, there can also be problems with putting the stakeholders in charge. Part of the issue here perhaps comes from the question of who knows best when it comes to policy. And there's two key problems with that stakeholder model. Firstly, stakeholders don't always agree. You know, it sounds simple, but the fact is that you can take 10 teachers and they'll have 10 different views on something a lot of the time. So questions about power always come into the decision about who to listen to. In a paper I'm working on at the moment, I look at competing versions of who the real teachers are and how the notion of what real teachers think is mobilized by competing political factions to justify rival policies. And that's something that links to the question of expertise, which we'll turn to in the second part. Secondly, there's also a difference between knowing about education and knowing about education policy. So as a teacher and as a school leader, I knew a lot about what the problems and the issues were in my classroom or in my school. So I had a sense of what needed doing, but I didn't know about what policy levers would bring about that change. And I didn't know how that particular thing might interact with a whole other domain of policies that existed in that space. So you can see that they're not the same skill set necessarily, and therefore we can't just put the stakeholders in charge. Of course, none of that is to say that parents and pupils and indeed teachers shouldn't have more of a voice when it comes to policy. And one of the things I notice in Singapore, Australia and New Zealand is there's much more of a tradition of bringing teachers into the ministry or of running secondments that allow the co-creation of policy. That's something that's not typically found in England. But nonetheless, I do think that it's inevitable that policy in education is profoundly political. And that's particularly the case given that education involves very deep questions about the transmission of values and the shaping of society. And as Bell and Stevenson also point out, sometimes education can play a particular role as a sort of flag bearer for where a politician stands or where a political party stands. It's got a sort of symbolic power as well. So there's no surprise that they want to hold on to it to some extent. So if education policy is not simply a case of listening to stakeholders, who does shape decisions? And one of the things I've seen on this trip is how much that varies from country to country. So in the UK, there's a concern at the moment, for example, with the over-dominance of the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, to the extent that James Plunkett has said that we have moved in English education policy from not from a question of what can be done towards the question of what can we get past the Treasury as being the dominant question in English education policy. Similarly, there are concerns with the dominance of the executive or the Prime Minister. So when Rishi Sunak was campaigning for the leadership of the Conservative Party recently, he started talking about maths a lot. Having been the Chancellor of the Exchequer, perhaps that's no surprise, and having been a banker. So that was his thing, maths, and he talked about this on the campaign trail. So no sooner did he become Prime Minister, suddenly there was a new policy about expanding maths teaching to 18-year-olds. And suddenly the Ministry of Education had to scramble into action. And I remember talking to one of the advisors in the ministry, a very senior advisor, who said, well, you know, clearly that's a priority, but is it the top priority at the moment? Not really, but we now have to all scramble into action to pursue that because that was the politically motivated priority at that particular time and the bugbear of that particular individual. And these political advisors and SPADs are also key in the education system. So we have special advisors, we have policy advisors, and they in a way almost govern with the minister within a ministry sometimes. So all of these trends are quite striking in the UK, but perhaps less evident elsewhere. The UK also has what's called a polycentric system with a thriving ecosystem of think tanks, unions, consultants, charities, all of them trying to get involved in education policy. So much so that 𝗙𝗘𝗔𝗗 et al. Have described the UK system as a consultocracy. And for them, as well as for academics like Sonia Exley and Stephen Bull, these ideas of this polycentric system is a real problem. But my view is that there's actually some problems with it, but also some benefits. In a way, we have this sort of thriving market for ideas that we were talking about earlier on. It means that everyone's bringing different ideas to the table. Those ideas are being debated and competed, which has some benefits in itself. Even though, on the other hand, it also means that different actors are sort of jostling for power. And it's sometimes almost like each of the different actors has like a share price that goes up and down depending on how much they're being listened to and how appealing their ideas are found. And with that many actors in the space, if you think of that busy ecosystem, it creates endless possible dynamics between them, which is why I have my little equation over there about all those different actors means that you can have even more interactions as each of them work with each other in different ways, which is why our policy theories like the advocacy coalition framework can be so important in understanding the dynamics in education policy. And it's also why it's no surprise, to return to my theme of chaos, but sometimes that black box spits out unexpected outcomes through what I call a process of horse trading. And let me give you one example of that. Now, this is a quote from a politician who was involved in a policy known as Universal Infant Free School Meals. So providing free school meals to all young children in school. And this is the story he tells. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, finally decided that he wanted to push through the married couple's tax allowance. And nobody other than Cameron really believed in it. Certainly not George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But Cameron got to that point in Parliament where he said, we've promised to do this thing, politically it's important, we've got to do it. So Nick Clegg, bearing in mind this was during a period of coalition government, which is very rare in England, Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was from the other party in the coalition, said, well, we think it's a complete waste of money. There's no evidence for it, it won't be effective, but we understand that it's politically sensitive for you. And we don't think uptake will be that great, so probably the cost won't be that much, but I will only agree if the equivalent amount of money is available for policy intervention that I will personally select. And so Cameron said yes. And that was where that policy of universal infant free school meals came from. So suddenly, all the schools had to build new kitchens very quickly because they didn't necessarily have rooms for everyone to sit and eat their meals. So suddenly, all of this money had to be invested in that, and it was pursued. In fact, the evaluations of it have been quite positive. So, and now London is trying to even expand it up the age range in the last few weeks. That decision's been made. So it hasn't turned out that badly necessarily. But we saw that this kind of scramble to meet this initiative came from this process of horse trading. So when we ask, how did that black box fit out that decision? We can see that it came from this kind of process of horse trading. And then the final thing I want to say about the different actors in the system is one thing that never ceases to amaze me, which is the importance of specific individuals. So if you look at secretaries of state, for example, their power varies dramatically. Someone like Michael Gove is known to have been a hugely influential secretary of state, whereas other secretaries of state were much less influential. So in a way, it almost seems like it's not necessarily the power of the office that matters, it's the power of the holder of the office that's key. And that happens in that wider policy space too. Specific individuals' names come up time and time and again in my interviews with policymakers. So even in New Zealand, for example, I kept hearing about a friend of mine, 𝗔𝗘𝗔𝗗𝘁, who had gone to New Zealand and who had a very divergent, different view to the dominant view there in New Zealand. And her name kept coming up because what she'd done was very much disrupted the thinking in that ecosystem. And though people strongly disagreed with her and were generally being critical, what they were saying was that she'd still had this important influence by disrupting what was thinking. And that was just one individual who decided to move to New Zealand. So I think that's really important to recognize that part of what's coming out of that black box is the effect of a specific individual. So that brings us to the end of the first half of what we're going to discuss. And I'm now going to bring you a couple of questions for us to take your votes on using the Slido. So you're going to have to scan this to find those questions. And we're going to take a poll of those and you're going to help us facilitate this.
So I think as we give Loic a break to catch his breath and have a bit of water, ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to please participate in the Slido quiz? I'm not being picked up by the microphone. Hello? I know everyone in this room can hear me, but I think the problem is everyone not in this room might not be able to hear me. It is turned on.
Okay, shall I'll move it on to the first question.
Can you
do that
me?
myself?
No?
I'm going
to try as much as I may. I can't give Loic a break.
Okay.
Those of you in the room hear my voice, but
okay. Do you want me to carry on?
Yes, please.
Fine. Okay, so that first question is one of those ones I touched on, which is where do you think the balance should be in education policy between stability and responsiveness? So if you look on Slido, you should be able to see the poll, and hopefully those of you online will be able to vote too. So at one extent, 1 on the left, we have stability, and 5 is responsiveness. So where should the balance lie?
Can you hear now?
That sounds better.
All right, we'll just give this another couple more seconds as I figured out how to make a microphone work. Right, we'll move to the next question. You can still continue to vote on the first question. So who do you think are the most important groups influencing education policy in your jurisdiction at this moment? So I know a number of you in this room especially come from various parts of the world influenced by education policy as it happens in a number of jurisdictions. So please let your opinion be heard.
I have to write the answer on this one. So
that'll
take long.
Then I will type the answer out.
Oh, I didn't expect to see learners being so influential.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see the bias towards responsiveness on the last one. I thought was interesting too.
So as everyone's typing their responses into the Slido function, I also invite those of you online to continue to do so. I think as we take a short break from Loic's talk before we move to the second half, maybe we want to discuss a little bit. Well, we have one more question. Sorry, my mistake, clearly. We have one more question to go before we take a shot. How similar or different do you think teachers' and parents' views are on education policy? You get to vote. So 1, you think there's perfect alignment between parents and educators, and 5, you think there's a total divergence.
Be interesting to know what the divergence is.
Yeah.
Strong sense of divergence there.
I've also just figured out what score with a star means. That's the average. I was thinking why that was there and why it kept on changing. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you're voting, I think Loic brought up a very interesting point. I mean, there's about 20% that voted complete divergence, 40% for number 4. Where do you think the divergence is? Those of you who voted, especially 4 or 5, particularly those who voted 5, why the divergence between what parents want and what educators want? Or where do you think that divergence is? Tell me no one in this room voted 4 or 5. If everyone is online, then how about those online? Why don't you put your perspectives in the Q&A? I'll be happy to read out your perspectives. But what do people think? Why the divergence? Do you think that what teachers want for their students, different from what parents want for their children? Yes, Chinka.
I think
Could you use the mic, please, because those online can't pick it up.
I think as parents are very, very interested in economic prosperity so that I can retire very well. From an educator's point of view, I think it'll be more of what it makes sense for educations to contribute to society and the future. And recently, I was just talking to one of my authors, and she's a very accomplished public relations so-called expert, at the same time a mother. And he says that the problem with today's education is that the parents have a very different concept of what it means to be successful from what the society would consider as successful in the area of education. For the parents, I want my child to go into, aspects where they can earn lots of money, accountants, lawyers, or medical professionals. So it is a selfish agenda. But from the educator's point of view, I believe they are more interested of what makes humanity continue to work. So I believe that is the divergence that we're talking about.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
It's a very interesting perspective, and I do find it interesting, and I'm going to chime in with my own little opinion here, that I would think that in many education systems where teachers' performance reward structures are measured against student performance, that oftentimes teachers may not necessarily want students to be the best they can be for society, but instead the best grades that they can achieve, because that's how teachers are remunerated, that's how teachers may be rewarded, many systems rank and organize teachers, and oftentimes it's based on student performance. And that could be a bit of an issue, that you may be educating for grades rather than educating for the holistic development of a child. And to me, that's where I would see the divergence, but I'm not a parent. So I don't know what the parents' views are. I just hope I didn't disappoint mine by working in a not very financially rewarding sector. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I think as we're talking about this and me not complaining about my challenges, yeah, anyone else would like to share their perspectives? Those of you who said their alignment between what we see with educators and parents, why that alignment? Where do you think that alignment exists? Do you think that it's for the benefit of the child, benefit of society, benefit of the system? Any perspectives? Okay, if not too much from the audience here, I do see some questions popping up on Q&A or comments. I think we have one from Margaret. It says, parents see education policy is only to regulate the schools, teachers, principals, and learning process in the school. There's an interesting question here. I'm going to post the question, but please don't answer it till the end. Do you think the education system should be overthrown and we should start all over? I'm not sure which country we're thinking of here, because if globally we do that, that will be kind of fun. But I think it's something interesting for everyone here to ponder, I think, as we move on in the discussion, and to give everyone a chance to, is the system that broken? I know many different jurisdictions are represented in this room. Maybe speak of your own system that you're familiar with. Is it that broken? Should we totally scrap it and start over again? Or should we look for incremental changes? Let me go back to the couple of the last Slido responses and just hear perspectives. Let me see if I can move that back. Yes. Here we asked the question about who are the most important. So I think very clearly, many say government. I think politicians in government, we can kind of see them as being similar.
That's the thing, there's almost pulling that apart, isn't there? Because part of government is the bureaucracy and part of government is the politicians. Yeah. And one of the things you see as you travel around is the relative weighting of those two and the nature of the interaction. So if you look on my LinkedIn, there's an article I posted a couple of days ago about some of my observations about how that varies in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And there are some quite profound differences. So within this question of government, there's a lot in there. And even, are you talking about the policy advisors and special advisors within the ministry, or are you talking about the more technical staff or more junior staff or the more, so there's one of the things to pull apart in that black box is actually where the power lies within government. And, is it number 10 with David Cameron wanting one policy, or is it the Treasury trying to block it, or is it, these are complex dynamics to pull apart.
I think I just want to point out a few interesting responses that came up. Tech companies. I think that's an interesting response. I think they have a growing influence in education policy. And it'll be interesting to see what, the rest of you in the room think about it as we move to the Q&A towards the end. Another interesting response is governance. And I think that speaks to the decentralization of many education systems, especially in Southeast Asia. You can see more and more where individual states are given a lot more autonomy in terms of education, and where a lot of their autonomy lies in the hands of the governor rather than a central government. So I think that tension between the central government and individual state governments is something interesting to think about too.
Yeah, and local government in the UK has been very much sidelined from education, having previously been a very powerful part.
So I got a response about education system being overthrown in the Zoom. That was specifically of the Singapore context. So those of you from the Singapore system may want to comment on this later on. I think there are few other interesting questions being posed in the Q&A, but I'll wait towards the end before we ask those questions, because I think Loic would like to share a little bit more perspectives that he has, and then we'll move on back to a Q&A session. So Loic, back to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your thoughts in that. That made it really interesting, and particularly having people from different places. That's great. So in this second half, I want to turn to what I've called curating education policy. And the first part of that helpfully fits with one of the questions I've just seen in the chat, so that's handy. So there's a question in the chat about education, research and evidence and its influence. And this is what I want to talk about now, which is the question of evidence and expertise. Because one of the most commonly said things about what education policy should be like is that it should be evidence-based. If you go back to a pivotal moment in English education policy, in 1976, the Prime Minister, 𝗔𝗯cie𝘂𝘁𝘁, made a speech known as the Ruskin speech, and it was considered to be a turning point in English education policy. Within that, one of the biggest arguments, the key cornerstone arguments of what he said, was that it was time for a rational debate based on facts about education. And different versions of this argument can be found time and time again across the political spectrum, but they're made in slightly different ways. So on the left in politics, there's often calls to listen to the evidence from academics, to look at peer-reviewed evidence, or to listen to unions providing frontline evidence from the front line. So those are all, in some ways, a form of calls to evidence. Meanwhile, on the right of politics, these arguments are more often framed in terms of what works, particularly through randomized controlled trials and so on. So there's these kind of different arguments that are both about using evidence more, but made in slightly different ways. Now, there's a whole debate around this idea of evidence-based education, which some of you will be familiar with, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on it. There's a particularly important article by 𝗙𝗘𝗔𝗗 called Why What Works Doesn't Work. But what I want to look at here is mainly the question of how it does influence it. Before I do that, though, I think this is a helpful quote to understand some of the limitations. So evidence and expertise, and why it's a flawed ideal to just say it should just be evidence-based. So I'll read it out again. You should take the evidence into account, but the other evidence doesn't tell you what to do. It never has and never will. Let's say you can prove that teaching a literacy hour, that I mentioned earlier, perfectly will improve results. That still doesn't tell you, should you force a teacher in Cornwall, in the far southwest of England, to do that when they don't want to? That's a policy decision. Or you could say, we've shown that we can reduce poverty by doing these things, maybe universal infant free school meals. And it costs this much, but there's still a decision to make about whether reducing poverty is your priority as a government or not. You might want to have another priority. As Dave Brailsford, the guy who ran British Cycling, says, the data informs, it doesn't decide. And that is basically it. There is no neutral evidence that can just be implemented. And in education, as you know very well, it's contested anyway. So that was a former advisor to the Secretary of State who went on to be an advisor to the Prime Minister who said that. And I think it's quite helpful because it shows a series of things. Firstly, he talks about values, showing that even when evidence does point to a particular answer, what questions are asked and what outcomes are aimed for are still key, and that is a values-based decision. It therefore shows that the aspiration to be entirely evidence-based is not realistic, and frankly, I'm not sure is actually desirable. It's perhaps overly technocratic. And this takes us all the way back to the sociologist Weber, who back in 1919 gave a lecture on politics as a vocation. And in it, he talked about the role of conviction in politics. He talked about the fact that politics is based on substantive rationality, which involves values, not just on formal rationality. Secondly, this advisor notes the contested nature of evidence. And that's important because it's easy to overestimate the degree to which evidence provides certainty. Partly, that's because people weight different types of evidence differently. So some people might prioritize quantitative data, others qualitative. Some might be interested in lived experience. Some people might want to look at experimental studies, and others might want to look at international studies. For most people, it's going to be a mix, but which are weighted more is a question we'll come to shortly, and which I think is quite important and changes what you think the evidence says. Also, the answers can be contradictory. So if you look at studies of different countries, every time PISA comes out, we get a rapid rush to find out what that evidence tells us. So when Finland shot to fame for its PISA results, we got a quick succession of a book called Finnish Lessons followed by real Finnish lessons, 2 books that drew almost opposite conclusions. And Professor Gopi, you've written too with Professor Deng about how conclusions are drawn from Singapore that are not necessarily backed up in the evidence. So we see that there's these contested conclusions that are drawn from these so-called high-performing education systems when we look at that type of evidence. So there's limitations to that type of evidence. Thirdly, education policy questions also have many of the features of Rittel and Weber, what Rittel and Weber back in the 1970s described as wicked problems. So these are quite problems that are characterized by a high degree of complexity, making it very hard to use evidence to solve them. We can also see that if we go back to this idea of the funnel, that evidence is always viewed through a particular lens and through various filters. And part of that is about the pragmatic constraints. Something might work, but it might not be palatable to the public or to the people working in the sector. And that might make it discarded as not being an option, despite it being evidenced. Also, the timing is an important factor here. So there's a question of pace, right? So if you're trying to have rigorous evidence, sometimes that's not possible when you're trying to move fast. That's particularly a problem in countries that, like Australia and New Zealand, that have 3-year electoral cycles or where there's rapid changes in government. In fact, the former schools minister, Andrew Adonis in England, once said that the problem with piloting things and the reason things weren't always piloted was that in our system in England, by the time you got the evidence from a pilot, you might no longer have the opportunity to act on it because your political capital by then might have died away and you might be preparing for the next election. So even there, we see that there's this lens of, what evidence is actually actionable in a fast enough period of time. So doing the evidence-based thing is really not that simple. Yet somehow I'm talking about evidence and expertise in a talk about how policy does happen. So how does it influence policy? Well, there are plenty of examples of where it has, perhaps fewer in the UK than there might be here, and perhaps fewer when we talk about policy as initiative than when we talk about policy as reform. Nonetheless, if we take the example of tutoring and small group tutoring in the UK, which was introduced as part of a response to the pandemic, that was an example of something that had clearly been informed very strongly by a thorough review of the evidence, even though it was also linked to these pragmatic constraints. So we saw there, and the same happened in Victoria and Australia, this initiative was selected based on a review of the evidence, and expert bodies were advising on that. So it happens. And in fact, what I'd argue that there's a certain key moments where evidence has an opportunity to make a change. Firstly, in building the case for a problem, so helping to select a priority issue. So even if Kingdon's garbage can model of policymaking suggests that the evolution of problem definition takes place in a separate stream to the evolution of a solution, we can still see that in defining that problem, evidence is often part of the picture. Secondly, evidence is often used in tweaking and refining the detail of a proposed policy, and that can happen through processes of consultation. And thirdly, it can happen through what I call a gradual shifting of the zeitgeist, which is something I'm going to turn to very shortly. So those are all moments when evidence can play a part. So what type of evidence is important? Because I've talked about the fact that there are these different types of evidence that are valued differently by different people. Well, this question actually links us back to the earlier theme of different actors and their kind of varying share prices, as I described it. Because it may not always be that it's the quality of evidence that determines how influential it is. A study in the US by Reckau et al. Shows that the carriers of evidence, i.e. who presents the evidence, and the relationship they have with the policymakers, is often a bigger determinant of what happens than what the evidence actually was. And that's why I talked about that question of share price, because the actor who's presenting the evidence might have varying levels of credibility. So who provides it and how much credibility they have is often key. Policymakers in England often talk about evidence that's come from the leaders of high-performing schools, and they say it's particularly valued if it comes from one of those people. And similarly, in New Zealand, I was told by one policymaker that one set of arguments had been disregarded in a consultation because it came from the leaders of some low-performing schools that lacked that legitimacy and credibility. And then if we look at studies of epistemic communities, so this is a term used to describe communities of experts that seek to influence policy. Some of that literature flags up the role of fit. So the role of fit between those actors and the politicians they seek to influence. And where there's a meshing of the way they look at the world, they're more likely to interact and to learn from each other. So that's what we learn from the theory of epistemic communities. There's also a study by the Australian Education Research Organisation where they spoke to decision makers, and what they found was that actually policymakers had limited interest in the provenance of the evidence because they took it for granted that if it came to them from trusted bureaucrats, then it was probably thoroughly researched already. And then when we come to that international evidence, we talked about PISA earlier on, we can see that people don't look at every single country in PISA, they look at particular countries. And that's because a different type of fit comes into play when looking at international evidence. So evidence from jurisdictions that countries feel an affinity for is often valued more. Talking to people in New Zealand, they often talked about Wales, despite the fact that it doesn't perform particularly well in some ways. But they looked at Wales because it had a shared bicultural heritage. So they have Welsh and English in their schools in the same way that they have Maori and English in the schools in New Zealand. And there was a sort of philosophical alignment. And they said they didn't like to look at the US because they felt there was such a political disjoint between them that they were found to be unpalatable. So they were looked at less. So that kind of evidence was downgraded because it came from a country with whom they had less affinity. So when it comes to evidence, we can see that these personal and political factors can be very important, and that policymakers can often be willing to trade off a degree of scale or rigor or causal evidence if there's a greater degree of fit and applicability. And there's also an emotional dimension. So often stories can carry much more weight. I remember interviewing a policymaker and they told me about how they changed their views on something, despite being someone who was very, very data-driven, because their secretary had experienced something with their own child. And because they knew that secretary and that story resonated for them, it was therefore more influential than all the evidence they'd actually looked at. But in a way, stories can be seen as a form of evidence, despite the fact that we call them anecdotes when we want to talk about them pejoratively. So it's probably not realistic to expect evidence to be looked at in a neutral and dispassionate way, which brings me to my final theme, which is about narratives and frames and how they shape this zeitgeist of the kind of feeling of a moment. And I first got interested in this when I wanted to understand how attitudes to special educational needs and disabilities had shifted over time and how those issues were prioritized by policymakers. Because it's clear that issues like that can shift in so-called salience over time. They can become more important, less important, down-weighted, up-rated. And I wanted to understand how that happened. Because actually, beyond particular issues, there can also be deep undercurrents to the way we look at things or the way we think about problems. So to understand how policy happens, you also need to understand how mindsets and ideologies can grip people, as well as communities and as well as policymakers. And that can provide one of the most powerful funnels around decision making by defining what's believed to be doable or what's palatable, defining the so-called Overton window in policy. I remember, for example, in my early days of running a think tank, it was just in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And the dominant narrative at that time was austerity. We had a metaphor, politicians said that the country had maxed out its credit card. And as a result, I was told there's no point writing any recommendations in any report that will cost any extra money. There's just no point. So that was really shifting the advice I was giving on policy. Meanwhile, in some countries, again, with those falling or low PISA scores, there can be a narrative of crisis, which is the big driver behind policy decisions. And that's a narrative. And in some countries, that narrative takes hold. In other countries, it doesn't. New Zealand has falling PISA scores, but people don't have that much of a sense of crisis because they decide that it's not actually showing what matters. So a narrative can take hold or not take hold, depending on things. But beyond that, we can also have underlying national stories and policy orientations that create much more lasting narratives. So if we take here in Singapore, that story of Singapore's gaining its independence and the importance of human capital in building the nation is obviously a very important influence on education policy here for shaping a sort of human capital orientation. I also spent one summer teaching in Rwanda, where the context of the post-genocide settlement meant that there was also a focus on inclusion and on citizenship building, on shared citizenship as a big driver. And this is a diagram from Bell and Stevenson once again, that shows how those different policy orientations can feed through to different policy decisions. So looking at, on one hand, an orientation towards citizenship and social justice, and on the other hand, towards human capital. But beyond setting the vision, the ideas and ideologies, they can also, these framings can also shape the preferred strategy for pursuing a vision. So Michael Barber, the former advisor, points out that under the premiership of Margaret Thatcher in the UK, policymakers were asked constantly, with every problem, can the solution involve creating a market? Because that was the theory of change, but creating markets around things would be the best way to solve them. And you can see the same things like with ideas in education, like the idea of autonomy or meritocracy or efficiency or inclusion or excellence or competition. These are all different ways of looking at things and thinking about solving problems. And they can provide an underlying belief or almost a theory of change for how best to bring about change and how best to solve problems. But the problem is that sometimes those theories of change can clash. So in my interviews, I've been asking policymakers a lot in the UK about school autonomy, because that was in theory, the theory of change that was driving the Conservative government for that period. It was one of the rationales, if you remember, for those free schools. And yet there were other policies like that phonics check, which were actually seen as limitations to autonomy. And in a way, somehow these policymakers had to reconcile two competing narratives, one of accountability and one of autonomy. And there was this constant process of trying to blur the edges, trying to resolve the tensions between those two narratives, which can force policymakers into these kind of strange contortions. It's quite interesting when I look back at my transcripts of the policymakers involved in this, how they try and explain it, and they find lots of different ways, which I'm hoping to do a paper about how to square that circle. And those clashes can be really controversial. For over a decade in England, the default in the provision of education services has been for government to outsource or procure, partly driven by that market-driven philosophy that Thatcher introduced. So there can be this desire to encourage competition and shrink the state through that procurement. And yet recently, the government took the opposite step. It brought in-house Oak National Academy, an online learning platform that had been set up independently by teachers during the pandemic, and it decided to bring that in-house, effectively nationalizing it. Now that has generated a huge controversy because it seems to be a shift in the theory of change. And it's even led to a massive court case, which is an example of how governments can embed a way of doing things in institutions and in laws. So we can see there that these narratives are not always smooth, and much though it might be nice to have a clear strategic orientation or theory of change that guides policymaking, these can often be much more complex than that. But at the same time, I've described that and these narratives as if they just exist out there and that there's no control over them. And that policymakers are these sort of passive recipients of these narratives, but that's not the case. Firstly, policymakers can intentionally tap into different narratives or mobilize them and propagate them as these sort of discursive or ideological resources that they can draw on for backing for policies. I spoke to one senior civil servant who told me the story of how when England developed an early career framework for teachers, he was able to dial up and dial down different narratives. So at times emphasizing efficiency and at other times emphasizing professional autonomy. And it depends. To the Treasury, he spoke about efficiency. If he was speaking to the teaching profession, he talked about professional autonomy and so on. And he credits the fact that this was quite unusual for the UK in being a well-resourced and well-supported policy initiative, with the fact that he was so effectively able to tap into two different narratives that drew on different people. Similarly, policy entrepreneurs, people running think tanks like I was, can tap into and shape different narratives. So people always ask me, as a CEO of a think tank, what's the biggest impact you've ever had? And they expected me to talk about a specific initiative. And I'd always say to them that yes, there's specific initiatives I can point to, but actually the most powerful influence I can ever have is in helping to shift that zeitgeist, in talking about particular things in particular ways to move them up the priority and change the way people think about things. And for some organizations, they've built entire business models around that. So there's an organization called the Frameworks Institute in England, which has worked with a charity, the 𝗔𝗯ance Foundation, to find new ways of talking about poverty, to change public attitudes to poverty and welfare. So they're really mobilizing the importance of narratives as the core mission of what they're doing. And of course, the media is key too. So Cohen remarks that although the media can never tell people what to think, it is remarkably effective in telling people what to think about. So that's a key difference. And that's part of that shaping of the zeitgeist and a sense of what the big issues of the day are. So in a way, policy seems to emerge partly over this competition over ideas and discourses, which is what makes the so-called argumentative turn in policymaking so important. So we're going to pause again there, and I'm going to give you a few questions to reflect on about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Loic. I've got a new microphone because the last one didn't work very well. All right, we are back again to Slido, ladies and gentlemen, those of you joining us in the room and those of us. So, guys, I can't see the question myself. All right.
Do you want me to read them out?
I'll just read them out.
Okay.
All right. So, what are the most valued features of education policy evidence in your jurisdiction? What are the main priorities for policy education in your jurisdiction? And which theory of change guides education policy in your jurisdiction? So we're going to ask these questions and we're going to give you time to vote. So this is the first question. You've got 4 choices: experimental design, large scale, applicability to local context, and having been peer reviewed. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to take too long with each question, but I only see 5, 4. Why? Should the number be going up or down?
Yeah, it's going up.
Okay, yeah, okay. It makes sense to me now. More people are signing in. All right. So since one person's ranking, we'll move to the next question. What are the main priorities for education policy in your jurisdiction? This is an open-ended.
I don't think it is.
Is it?
Go
Oh,
again.
no, sorry.
Shouldn't be.
Clearly, I wasn't at the rehearsal. So we have inclusion, equity, state building and citizenship, employability, high academic standards.
Cool, close on the top 2. I'm sure this one varies so much between countries.
All right, and we'll go to the last question. Which theory of change guides education policy in your jurisdiction? All right, ladies and gentlemen, as you vote for the last question, I'm going to hand the mic back to Loic for his closing comments. In the interest of time, we will come back to your responses on Slido, so we'll have an opportunity to unpack them, to discuss them. But for now, I think Loic,
I'll just
make your closing remarks.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, as I've tried to, thank you. Great. Okay. So I want to go back now to these kind of linking themes of funnels and chaos, because today I've talked about history, different actors and the interactions between them, evidence and expertise, narratives and ideas. And clearly I've covered each very briefly and we need a lecture for each, but my research so far suggests that together, these combine to drive these two dynamics of funnels and chaos. So on one hand, they narrow and shape how problems are framed, selected and seen, defining that Overton window of what can be thought, what can be said, and what is likely to get support. And that funnel is also based on what tools and resources are available, whether in terms of time or whether in terms of budgets. The context can shape that with things like the global financial crisis, where one of the things I mentioned, the Brexit vote in the UK was obviously crucial, the changing political capital of different leaders, and the length of a political cycle, that 3-year term in New Zealand and Australia. So all of those tools, those affect the tools and resources that are available, funneling down which options are looked at. And that funnel also includes this inevitably contested question of what is actually likely to work. But at the same time, we should be careful of thinking that this process is too ordered and logical. The former civil servant, Maurice Kogan, once said that politicians are existential victims of circumstance. And although these different types of policy, whether these kind of initiatives or these long reforms can lend themselves to different types of dynamics, my research is littered with examples of unexpected outcomes. Things like the Prime Minister going on a show with a TV chef and having to find a policy to announce on school meals. Or the Treasury suddenly blocking a measure that had long been planned unexpectedly. Or perhaps a compromise being reached to get some policy through Parliament but in time for an election. So yet people looking at this black box from the outside can sometimes assume that perhaps there's this kind of grand master plan behind it all. Dominic Cummings, the architect of Britain's Brexit vote, once said that people think that somewhere there's this door that opens into a quiet, calm control center filled with policy ninjas. But the thing is, there is no door and there are no ninjas. So instead, hopefully what I've tried to do today is to give you like just opening up a little window into that black box, even if I can't open the door and show you the ninjas.
Thank you very much for those closing comments. Part of me feels like I'm watching Yes Minister once again.
Aha, but the question is it Yes Minister or the thick of it? That is what my blog is about.
So ladies and gentlemen, I think now we have two things that we need to do. I think it'll be a good opportunity for us to try to unpack some of the responses that we observed from the earlier Slido questions, which I'm going to try to move back on. And we can also use this opportunity to take some questions from the floor, both those of you who are joining us online and those of you in the room with us. Second, let me move this.
Rearrange the furniture.
Rearrange the furniture, we get a bit more space.
Sometimes policy making is a question of rearranging the furniture.
All right. So I think the first question that we asked was most valued feature of education policy evidence. And the majority of you talked about applicability to local contexts. Would anyone like to share their perspectives? Is there something among the options that were not, was there an option that's not there that you would think would be extremely important feature of policy evidence in where you come from? Anything missing? Those of you who are joining us online, feel free to drop your thoughts in the Q&A section. But anyway, yes, ma'am. Use the mic, please. A colleague will bring it over. Sorry, I have to insist on using the mic because otherwise people on Zoom can't hear you.
Hello, yeah. Not specifically to this question, but related to this question, I had a small question. So how I see evidence is, it is an input to the black box that you mentioned and policy as an output to the box, right? But from my personal experience, how I see policy is happening these days is, we already have a policy in mind and then we move backwards. We find evidence to support that policy. So in keeping that in mind, how do we answer this question then? Is that question even relevant then?
Yeah. So yeah, it's sort of retrofitting, isn't it? Retrofitting the evidence to a policy, I guess, is but then, yeah. So I guess there you're suggesting perhaps a different option which might be fit with the existing policy. Is that?
I mean, based on your experience, how do you then see policy making as a concept based on evidence?
So I do think it can vary. It varies depending on this type of policy. So I think if there's one of these initiatives, like the free school, universal infant free school meals, the evidence there to some extent was then retrofitted onto it. It turned out actually not to be that bad, but it was retrofitted. However, I think sometimes the evidence when it comes to the longer term reforms and so on, there are problems with a less certain political answer where politicians are more open to what the answer might be. So, for example, some school funding reforms that have taken place, or in terms of that example I gave of a post-pandemic response, there was, there were some options that were rejected, like extended school day. That was rejected for pragmatic reasons, but also because the evidence base was considered not to be strong enough and the cost too high. But the evidence was looked at as part of that, and it was a factor. And then, the evidence did look good on tutoring, and it happened to be convenient. So I think it's not the decisive factor, but I still think I don't think that means it doesn't happen. It's still part of that funnel.
Let's look at next question. I'm trying to see if it toggles here. All right. So what's the main priority of education in jurisdiction? I'm actually quite intrigued by the response, right? The highest is employability, followed by inclusion. High academic standards sort of tied with inclusion. Equity was, well, fourth. State building and citizenship was last. Why? Anybody in the room with a perspective? Do you think education focuses on employability? Is that a concern of education? And maybe, okay, let me pose a question then. When you answered this question, what part of the education ecosystem were you thinking about? Were you thinking about school education? Were you thinking about primary, elementary? Would your answer change if we told you what's the key factor of primary education versus what's the key factor of higher education? Would your answer have changed? Guys.
Shaking head over there. Ooh.
Hi, I will try to make sense of what I see here. So I think that in terms of the education policy, for example, in Singapore, I would say that with the recent concern with a compassionate meritocracy, because people can see, the sticky floors and sticky ceilings happening in Singapore, and that's not very healthy. So, and being a part of the MOE system for the last 18 years, I've just left, but don't tell anyone. Okay, I realized that, the central ideology plays a big part. Under a Minister of Education, peaks of excellence was the key word. I think some of you may remember. So a lot of the resources were put into the top schools, the specialized schools. Okay, and when it moved on recently, it became every school a good school. That was a tagline, and we could see big changes happening across. And now I'm in a community-based organization, and I'm working closely with the Uplift segment of MOE, Ministry of Education. So that's where we identify schools with high needs and we try and support them. And you can see that big policy shift because of education policy and the central ideology. And of course, being a part of the education system, I think I chatted with Vignesh and Loic just now. For the last 14 years of my career, I looked after the top 5% in a top school, and now I'm looking at the bottom 20% economically. I see that difference, and I'm quite thankful for these policy shifts. Not perfect though, the outcomes, but we are still working.
Thank you. Right. I'm just trying to see if we have any questions. Yes, Prof.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Necessarily related to this. Sorry.
A second. A mic will come your way.
This has to do with the relationship between evidence, education, research, and policy. If I reflect on the Singapore context, Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, 1997, Teach Less, Learn More, 2005, ICT master plans, were not based on evidence, but they were very radical shifts in policy. What was the prompt was an understanding that we are phasing out of an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy. I don't know whether there was evidence, but pretty much the political leadership was agreed that we needed to move into a new type of economy, and therefore the human capital argument as to what we should be doing in the schools had to change. And the research that came after that was basically on, if we had decided on changing the nature of pedagogy, what do we know about what teachers do and what students do in the school system? What was the nature of pedagogy in existence? How do we change it? What the levers were? And that resulted in a huge investment in educational research at NIE, Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice and all the rest of it. So sometimes the evidence comes after the policy decision has been made, and then to figure out how best to ensure that policy decision would reach. So we are now dealing with a huge mass of evidence, which I think feeds into policy development as well as teacher preparation.
I guess in a way there, but also you have a different levels, don't you? So you have a shift in policy at the very top strategic level. I talked about working at, my interest is in the top level and the mid level. And so that top level of what the goal was and what the strategy, what the vision was, might not have been something that's based so much on evidence. It's based more on a sort of judgment of what political priorities. However, the evidence then came in terms of how to operationalize that vision, right? So it's when I was talking about what points could evidence come in, one can be to change our sense of what the priorities are, you know, and that might be a whole range of that might be more consultation with the population or something like that, or observations of what's going on in other countries and global economic trends. You know, that can inform to some extent that vision at the top. However, the operationalizing is much more likely to be that type of evidence.
So what I have noticed is there are a number of questions coming up on the Slido, which I unfortunately can't see, but if we can move it a little bit, screen, we can see it a bit. No, yes, that'll be fantastic. Okay. What are the ways, okay, I think this is a good question. What are the ways to sustain and institutionalize a policy reform?
Well, I mentioned a couple of ways, didn't I? There was one is through legislative changes, so they can make something harder. So, for example, and that can be legislation in an area separate to education. So, for example, in that Oak National Academy court case, it's because of procurement regulations and rules about state intervention in competition law. So that's been that way of doing things has been institutionalized through legislation, which the courts are guarding, so through the institutions as well. Different institutions can be created. So we often see examples of curriculum authorities around the world being set up as a way of institutionalizing approach to curriculum, whereby things are, say, only reviewed once every 5 years. You can appoint people to particular roles. So if there's a powerful role, say, chairing a curriculum board, you might appoint a particular person to that, or a group of people onto that board who embody a particular fit with your outlook. So all of those are ways of institutionalizing something. I think that then come the questions of what else could be done. So I'm very interested at the moment in the UK because we're likely to have a change of government in the next year or two. Now, what happens in terms of those dialogues between the current ministers and the potential future ministers? Because that's not something that's often talked about, but it was so important in that example of the literacy strategy that I mentioned, where Gillian Shepherd and David Blunkett worked quite closely together despite being from opposing sides. So I'm quite interested in what spaces can be created for that type of dialogue and what work can be done whilst someone is a shadow minister, for example, in preparation for a transition to smooth it. But again, that brings us back to the question of how desirable is that continuity, or do we, you know, there's plenty of people, we've had people today say, should we tear everything down and start to scratch? So not everyone actually wants that continuity. So you have to get that right balance that we were voting on earlier.
You also need a political system that appreciates tolerance and cross-party cooperation. There's the same question from, there's another question from the same person. which appeared on the Zoom. And I think it's quite interesting, and I'm going to try to sort of summarize it, right? A lot of times policy reform fails because actors are not sufficiently motivated to see it through. So the question is, what can we do, especially for the middle managers and teachers who may often feel left out from the design, the creation process of the policy, to motivate them to be actively driving the implementation and sustaining the reform?
I think there's two schools of thought on this, actually, and I sometimes have sympathies with both. So one is the consultation model, which is that, if people are really bought in, but they've been consulted, then that you'll gain that buy-in. But that might be that's an important way, because you can make sure that it's informed by their lived experience, by their professional knowledge, and so on, that they understand the goals, that you might slightly tweak something to make sure it lands well with them, and so on. So that's one approach. And in New Zealand, for example, that's a really key driver of things. So they go through these processes of long consultations, of lots of dialogue between teachers and the unions with the ministry. Another approach, but then Michael Barber, who I mentioned a few times, argues quite strongly against that. He says that the way to gain buy-in is by demonstrating that something works and by doing a good job of implementation, and that buy-in comes only once people see that it works. And I think I'm not sure I buy the idea that you just impose it from the top, make it work, and you know best, and then then as long as you implement it well, everyone will be happy. But I do think there's something about demonstrating success, because people can be reluctant to change. I talked about those biases against switching. People are generally quite averse to those risks of changing. And so to some extent, you do have to show some tangible benefits if you really want people to buy in and get on board with something. So perhaps you do need to have a little bit of that snowball effect by starting small, showing some success, and then building.
Do you have any follow-up questions from the room? Because I've been taking quite a few from Zoom. Anyone in the room would like to ask a question before I go back to the online audience? Okay, I'm going to go back to the online audience. There's another interesting question here. I guess, you talked about a lot of things happening in the black box. So the question is the media in the black box?
Yes. Yeah, I think, and that depends obviously on different systems, but the media is very, very influential in the UK. And we have a system where a lot of the media is owned by particular interests and so on, with particular political agendas, which means that some things are just not palatable. So it really influences that funnel of what is and isn't doable because of how something will land in the media and be portrayed by the media. So they're definitely in there. I'm interested, for example, in the amount of dialogue that happens between policymakers and education correspondents, for example. So we have what part of the role of those special advisors and so on is to be in constant communication with the media, to be briefing them and trying to manage all of that. That was part of Dominic Cummings' role, and his skill was in managing to control that so effectively. So yeah, I think that it's a particularly important part of the black box, certainly in England.
So I think another question, not so much about how policy is designed, but how we should be thinking about education policy. And I'm summarizing a little bit of what I see on the chat. A lot of people are talking about lifelong learning, right? Technology is changing very rapidly. Many of us have to continually be learning and educating if we want to stay relevant. How do policymakers think about education policy design when it impacts everyone and it's not delivered through the traditional education ecosystem?
Well, two parts to that. One is, I think it's one of the arguments against overweighting the specific stakeholder groups, like overweighting parents or overweighting teachers, because actually it impacts society as a whole. So you shouldn't have a system where you're only thinking about one group of stakeholders like that. In terms of adult learning specifically, I mean, in England, I'd say it's not something that's thought about a lot. I think you're lucky to be in a system which is thinking about that a bit more. I think it's actually, we've recently had a paper that has been put out by the Labour Party in England that has suggested that might be a direction of travel by a future Labour government if we get one. So it might become part of the ecosystem, but at the moment it's very piecemeal in England.
All right, I've also been informed that we're kind of running out of time. So ladies and gentlemen, I think before we end today's session, I'd like to invite Loic to make any closing comments, remarks you'd like to make before we officially end this evening session.
I think mainly just to thank you firstly for welcoming me here and people in Singapore as well for chatting to me over the last few days. It's been really interesting talking to people. And yeah, for giving me your thoughts. Every time working on this book at the moment, which is the next year or so, and it's through these kind of conversations that I'm able to refine that thinking. You've helped me stress test it, so you all deserve credit when when it comes out as having been people who've involved in refining that. So I've left some contact details up there, and I'm always delighted to hear from people, and I can keep you posted on progress with the book and how we get on. And that's also my last book if you're interested in that one.
So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Mr. Loic Menzies for his very enlightening talk. I hope that through today's talk, you were able to peek a little bit into the black box, unravel a little bit of the mystery of what's happening inside. Is it chaotic? Is it peaceful? I guess we have something to think about. Ladies and gentlemen, please do follow our website as we have a few talks lined up in the coming months. Actually, we have another one later this month. I believe it's on the 20th. My face is there, so I should know. It's on the 20th of March, ladies and gentlemen. So do join us if you can, both in person and online. We're going to be looking at cyber resilience through education. So once again, right, technology is changing rapidly. All our young people are going to be exposed. They're growing up in a digital environment. They're digital natives. But how do we ensure that they're protected, safe, and resilient? So do join us if you're able to. I think the details will be posted on our website pretty soon. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And once again, Loic, thank you so much for being a part of today's session. Thank you.